The biting morning air nipped at Tyrese's cheeks, turning them a rosy hue that contrasted starkly with the muted gray of the hospital walls. He sat perched on the edge of the cold metal bench, his small hands tucked deep into the worn pockets of his oversized jacket. St. Luke's. It had become his unlikely sanctuary, a strange blend of antiseptic sterility and raw, pulsing life. He'd been coming here for weeks, a silent fixture in the pre-dawn landscape. Each morning, he'd watch the revolving door spit out weary doctors and nurses, their faces etched with the night's burdens. He'd watch the ambulances scream into the emergency bay, their flashing lights painting fleeting streaks of crimson across his face. He'd watch the families huddled together, their whispered prayers mingling with the rumble of the city waking. He watched, absorbed, as if trying to decipher a hidden code within the hospital's chaotic rhythm. It wasn't fear or morbidity that drew him here. It was something else, a pull he couldn't articulate, a subtle resonance that hummed beneath the surface of his awareness. "Morning, Miss Glenna," Tyrese mumbled, his voice barely audible above the whoosh of the automatic doors. The security guard, a stout woman with kind eyes and a perpetually weary expression, offered a tired smile. "You know you're not supposed to hang around this long, baby," she said, her voice laced with a gentle reprimand that lacked any real heat. Tyrese had become a familiar face, a harmless anomaly in her otherwise predictable routine. "I'll leave in a minute," he replied, his gaze drifting towards the imposing glass facade of the hospital. Miss Glenna sighed, knowing he'd likely be gone before she finished her rounds. He always was. She'd never questioned his presence, sensing a quiet desperation she couldn't quite place. A child like him, alone it tugged at something deep within her, a maternal instinct she hadn't realized she possessed. He reminded her of her grandson, the same quiet intensity, the same way of looking at the world as if it held secrets only he could decipher. Tyrese rose, his thin frame swallowed by the oversized jacket. He felt a strange tug, a compulsion he hadn't felt before. He'd always stayed outside, content to observe from a distance. But today, something was different. He found himself walking towards the main entrance, his legs moving with a purpose he couldn't explain. He passed through the automatic doors, the sterile air of the hospital washing over him, carrying the faint scent of disinfectant and something else, something sweet, almost floral. He felt a tightening in his chest, a flutter of anticipation mixed with a prickle of unease. He knew he shouldn't be here. He knew he'd be asked to leave. Yet, he couldn't stop himself. His feet carried him down the brightly lit corridor, past bustling nurses' stations and anxious visitors. He felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if he'd walked these halls before, though he knew he hadn't. He stopped in front of a closed door marked Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, his hand hovering over the handle. Hesitation flickered across his face, a fleeting moment of doubt. What was he doing? What did he expect to find? He pushed the door open, slipping inside before anyone could notice. The PICU was a world of hushed whispers and beeping machines. The air was thick with a mixture of antiseptic and the cloying sweetness of illness. Tyrese moved silently, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the rows of beds, each occupied by a small, still figure. He felt a pang of empathy, a sharp understanding of their vulnerability. He knew what it was like to be small and alone, to feel the weight of the world pressing down. He stopped before a bed in the corner, his gaze fixed on the girl lying within. Leah Ellison. He'd heard the nurses talking about her, the whispers of a tragic accident, a medically induced coma. He felt drawn to her, a connection that transcended logic or reason. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool glass of the incubator. He closed his eyes, his mind reaching out, searching for her. He saw flashes of images, vibrant and chaotic, a swirling kaleidoscope of colors. A bicycle, wheels spinning out of control, a terrified scream echoing in the darkness. He opened his eyes, his hand trembling as he reached for the worn sketchbook and charcoal pencil tucked inside his jacket. He began to draw, his hand moving with a frantic energy, capturing the fragmented images that flooded his mind. He drew the twisted metal of the bicycle, the blurred streetlights, the looming darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. He drew a girl, her face contorted in fear, trapped within a swirling vortex of color and sound. He didn't understand what he was drawing, only that he had to. It was as if he was compelled, driven by a force he couldn't control. He was so engrossed in his drawing that he didn't notice Nurse Norris approach. She stood silently beside him, her eyes widening in disbelief as she watched the images unfold on the page. She recognized the scene, the details of Leia's accident, details that had only been relayed within the medical team. A shiver ran down her spine. How could this boy, this homeless child who spent his days outside the hospital, know these things? He finished the drawing, his hand falling away as if exhausted. He looked up at Nurse Norris, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and understanding. "She's scared," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the machines. "She's trapped in a bad dream." Nurse Norris stared at him, her mind reeling. She'd seen her share of grieving families, of desperate parents clinging to hope. But this was something else entirely. This boy, this small, quiet boy, seemed to possess a gift, a strange and unsettling ability to see into the hidden corners of the mind. A flicker of doubt still lingered, a nagging voice of reason reminding her of the implausibility of it all. Yet the detail in his drawings, the uncanny accuracy, it couldn't be dismissed. She took a deep breath, her professional demeanor returning. "I need to show this to Dr. Ortega," she said, her voice hushed but firm. "And to Mr. Ellison." Tyrese nodded, his gaze returning to Leia. He felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet certainty that he had done what he needed to do. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't leave her. He had to stay, to watch over her, to help her find her way out of the darkness. The antiseptic scent, sharp and sterile, bit at Tyrese's nostrils. St. Luke's Regional Medical Center hummed with a low, rhythmic thrum, a symphony of beeping monitors and hushed whispers. It was a world away from the alleyways and dumpsters that had become his reluctant home. His worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, each step a small act of defiance against the gleaming, pristine world. He clutched the notebook tighter, the rough edges of comfort against his palm. Inside, nestled between pages filled with charcoal sketches, lay the key to the image that could bridge the chasm between his reality and the silent, sleeping world of Leia Ellison. Room 6C. He'd overheard it whispered amongst the nurses, their voices hushed with a mix of pity and professional detachment. 6C, where Leia slept, trapped in a world he could see. A middle-aged nurse, her name tag reading A. Norris, bustled past, her face etched with fatigue. Tyrese's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it, his chance. He had to try. "Excuse me," he piped up, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in the sterile corridor. Nurse Norris paused, a frown creasing her brow. Her gaze swept over him, taking in his threadbare clothes, the smudges of dirt on his cheeks. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, quickly masked by professional courtesy. "Yes, I need to see the girl in room 6C, Tyrese stated, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in his small hands. Inside, a whirlwind of doubt swirled. What if she dismissed him? What if she called security? But the image in his notebook, the drawing of Leia beneath a barren, twisted tree, burned in his mind's eye. He had to try. "Room 6C, Nurse Norris repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. "That's a private room. Are you family?" Tyrese swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Her name's Leia," he said, ignoring her question. "I need to see her." Nurse Norris' frown deepened. "I'm afraid I can't allow that. You need to leave." She made to move past him, her eyes already scanning the hallway, searching for a colleague or perhaps security. "Because I know her dreams," Tyrese blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush before he could stop them. Nurse Norris stopped dead in her tracks. The look on her face was no longer dismissive, but a strange mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "What do you mean you see where she goes?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. A tiny spark of hope ignited in Tyrese's chest. He opened his notebook, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages filled with his charcoal drawings. He paused at the one depicting Leia, her face pale and drawn, sitting beneath a gnarled, leafless tree. The background was a swirl of grays and blacks, the air thick with a palpable sense of unease. Nurse Norris leaned in, her eyes widening as she took in the detail of the sketch. The skepticism hadn't entirely vanished from her face, but it was now tinged with a flicker of something else, perhaps bewilderment, perhaps even a sliver of belief. This is Leia," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the hospital machinery. Tyrese nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the intensity of her scrutiny. It was more than just curiosity. It was a search for something tangible in a world of sterile instruments and clinical diagnoses. He knew this drawing was more than just lines on paper. It was a window into Leia's silent world, a world she was desperately trying to escape. He remembered the dream vividly, the chilling silence of the desolate landscape, the oppressive weight of the sky, the palpable fear emanating from Leia. He had felt it too, a cold dread that seeped into his bones as he sketched, translating her silent terror onto the page. "She's trapped," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "She needs help." Nurse Norris' eyes darted from the drawing to Tyrese, her mind clearly grappling with the impossible. He could see the internal struggle, the battle between logic and something intangible. He knew it was a long shot, but he also knew, with a certainty that defied explanation, that he was Leia's only hope. "Wait here," she said finally, her voice hushed, her expression unreadable. "Don't move." She disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. Tyrese stood there, clutching his notebook, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The antiseptic smell of the hospital, once overwhelming, now faded into the background as a new scent, faint and elusive, drifted towards him. It was the scent of rain-soaked earth, of decaying leaves, of the barren landscape he had drawn. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, and for a moment he was back under that twisted, leafless tree, feeling the chill of Leia's fear, a silent plea echoing in the desolate stillness. The antiseptic scent of the pediatric intensive care unit clung to Nurse Norris like a second skin. Years of sterile hallways and hushed anxieties had woven themselves into the fabric of her being. She hesitated outside room 6C, the rhythmic beep of the life support machine a constant, unsettling pulse in the otherwise quiet corridor. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed down her uniform, the crisp fabric a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions churning within her. That boy, so small, so sure. His claim, absurd as it sounded, echoed in her mind, refusing to be dismissed. "I can wake her up," he'd said, his dark eyes unwavering. A part of her, the pragmatic, medically trained part, scoffed at the notion. Yet, another part, a flicker of something almost forgotten, a whisper of hope perhaps, urged her forward. Graham Ellison sat slumped in a chair by the window, his face etched with an exhaustion that went deeper than sleep deprivation. His gaze was fixed on the manicured hospital grounds below, a world of vibrant green and bustling life that seemed to mock the sterile stillness surrounding his daughter. Norris approached cautiously, each footfall measured, hesitant. She'd seen this kind of grief before, the hollowed-out look of a man clinging to the frayed edges of hope. How could she possibly burden him with something so fantastical? Yet, the boy's drawings so detailed, so disturbingly accurate they couldn't be dismissed. "Mr. Ellison?" Her voice was soft, almost a tremor against the steady hum of the machines. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, unfocused. "Any news?" he rasped, the question barely audible. Norris felt a pang of sympathy. He clung to every word, every glance, desperate for a glimmer of positive change in Leia's condition. "There's a boy," she began, her voice catching in her throat. How could she possibly explain this? "He is homeless. He was found wandering the halls. He claims she says he can wake your daughter. Graham stared at her, his expression shifting from weary resignation to a flicker of incredulity. Wake her? How? His voice was sharp, brittle with desperation. Norris swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. He says she sees her dreams. The words sounded even more absurd aloud. A bitter laugh escaped Graham's lips. Dreams? My daughter is in a coma. She's not dreaming. He drew them. Norris persisted, pulling the folded papers from her pocket. He drew what she's seeing. He said she's trapped. Graham snatched the drawings, his hands trembling. He unfolded them slowly, his breath hitching. The first one depicted a twisted, nightmarish landscape. Dark, gnarled trees clawed at a stormy sky, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The second showed a bridge. A long, narrow bridge stretching into a swirling mist, leading to a locked gate. Leia, small and fragile, stood at the edge, her back turned to the viewer. Leia, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He traced the outline of his daughter's figure in the drawing, his fingertip trembling. He knew that bridge. It was from a park they used to visit, a place filled with happy memories. Now, in this context, it seemed sinister, foreboding. He disappeared, Norris said softly, breaking the silence. After he gave me these, security's looking for him. A part of her was relieved. This whole situation was beyond her, beyond reason. Graham didn't respond. He was lost in the drawings, his mind grappling with the impossible. A Brigia locked gate the next day. Nurse Norris was back on her rounds when a shadow fell across the nurse's station. She looked up to see the boy, Tyrese, standing there, as if he had materialized from the sterile air itself. He held another drawing, his small hand clutching it tightly. He's back, she murmured to herself, a strange mixture of unease and anticipation. It was illogical, irrational, but she felt a pull towards this enigmatic child, a sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Graham, alerted by the commotion, emerged from Leia's room. His eyes, still shadowed with grief, widened as he saw Tyrese. He strode towards the boy, his movements driven by a desperate hope he couldn't quite articulate. Tyrese, unflinching under Graham's intense gaze, offered the drawing. It depicted the same bridge, the same locked gate, but this time there was a figure standing on the other side, shrouded in mist. And on the back, scrawled in childish handwriting, was a message: "The key is under the tree." Graham's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a flicker of something akin to hope. What does this mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. Tyrese looked at him, his dark eyes holding a wisdom that belied his age. "She told me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She kept dreaming of the bridge. She said she needs the key to open the gate." Graham stared at the drawing, at the cryptic message. The park, the bridge, the tree. It was a place Leia loved, a place they visited often when she was younger. There was a large oak tree near the bridge. Could it be? He felt a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and a desperate, fragile hope. He looked at Tyrese, a question forming in his mind. He wanted to believe, needed to believe, but his rational mind screamed against the absurdity of it all. A homeless boy seeing his daughter's dreams, offering a cryptic clue, it was madness. Yet, the drawing, the details, the bridge, it was too specific, too real to dismiss. He turned to Dr. Ortega, who had arrived, drawn by the unusual gathering. "Doctor," he said, his voice urgent, "I need to go to the park. The park with the bridge. There's something I need to check." Dr. Ortega frowned, her expression a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Mr. Ellison, I understand your distress, but please," Graham interrupted, his voice laced with desperation. Just indulge me. Please." Dr. Ortega hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Ellison, but I'm coming with you." As they left the sterile confines of the hospital, Graham couldn't shake the image of the drawing from his mind. The bridge, the gate, the key, and the small, enigmatic boy who held the key to his daughter's fate. The boy who claimed he could speak to her in her dreams. The fluorescent lights hummed a sterile lullaby in the pediatric intensive care unit, their pale glow reflecting off the polished linoleum floor. Graham Ellison, his face etched with exhaustion, paced the hallway outside room 6C, the rhythmic squeak of his shoes a counterpoint to the rhythmic beeping emanating from within. Each beep was a tiny hammer blow against the fragile wall of his composure. 5 days. 5 days since Leia's accident. 5 days since his vibrant, laughing daughter had become a silent prisoner within her own mind. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble scratching against his palm. Hope, a flickering ember, threatened to be extinguished by the cold reality of her unchanging condition. A small figure, perched on a bench against the wall, caught his eye. A boy, no older than 10, with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. He was sketching furiously in a worn notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. Graham recognized the image taking shape the twisted, gnarled branches of a dead tree, a recurring motif in the drawings Leia had produced in the weeks leading up to the accident. He stopped before the boy, a sudden, irrational surge of anger pulsing through him. What could this child possibly know about the terrors that haunted his daughter's dreams? "You drew this." Graham's voice was rough, edged with suspicion. The boy looked up, his gaze unervingly direct. There was a quiet strength in those dark eyes, a composure that belied his age and apparent homelessness. The worn clothes, the smudges of dirt on his face, they spoke of hardship, of a life lived on the fringes. Yet, there was no trace of fear or subservience in his demeanor. "I see it," the boy replied, his voice a low murmur. "The dream. She's trapped." Graham felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Trapped. The word resonated with a chilling accuracy. He'd seen that same trapped look in Leia's eyes just before the accident, a fleeting expression of fear he hadn't been able to decipher. He looked at the drawing again, the stark black lines on the page mirroring the darkness that had settled over his own world. Could this boy, this waif of a child, truly see into Leia's subconscious? "Who are you?" Graham asked, his voice softening, a flicker of desperation replacing the anger. "Tyrese," the boy answered, closing the notebook. "Tyrese Barnett. I can help her." Graham scoffed, the sound hollow even to his own ears. "Help her? How could a homeless child possibly help when a team of the best doctors in the city were at a loss?" Yet, the unwavering certainty in Tyrese's eyes, the quiet confidence in his voice, planted a seed of doubt in Graham's mind. A desperate, irrational seed that began to take root in the barren soil of his despair. He was clutching at straws, he knew. But what choice did he have? "Ow!" The word was barely a whisper. Tyrese opened the notebook again, flipping through pages filled with a series of disturbingly detailed drawings. Twisted trees, shadowed figures, a recurring image of a girl with vacant eyes standing at the edge of a precipice. "She's afraid," Tyrese explained, his finger tracing the outline of the girl. "She needs to remember. To let go." Graham's mind raced. Remember? Let go? What was Leia trying to forget? The accident? Something else? He remembered the therapist they'd seen months ago, the vague concerns about Leia's increasing anxiety, the nightmares she'd refused to talk about. He dismissed it then, attributing it to the pressures of school, the anxieties of growing up. Now, looking at the haunting images in Tyrese's notebook, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. 5 minutes, Graham said, the words escaping before he could fully process the decision. He led Tyrese into room 6C, the antiseptic smell sharp in his nostrils. Leia lay motionless on the bed, her face pale against the white sheets, wires and tubes snaking around her small body. The rhythmic beeping of the machines filled the room, a constant reminder of her precarious state. 5 minutes, Graham repeated, his voice tight with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm watching everything." Tyrese walked to Leia's bedside, his small hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. He closed his eyes, his face serene, as if listening to a silent melody only he could hear. Graham watched, his breath held captive in his chest. He was a man of logic, of reason. He didn't believe in miracles, in the supernatural. Yet, standing there, Watching this strange, enigmatic boy commune with his daughter, he felt a sliver of hope ignite within him. A tiny flame in the vast darkness. He didn't understand it, couldn't explain it, but he clung to it with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a raft. 5 minutes. It was all he had. 5 minutes to see if this improbable, impossible scenario could somehow, against all odds, bring his daughter back. The hum of the machines, the quiet rustle of Tyrese's clothes, the shallow breaths of his daughter, they filled the silence of the room, each sound and note in a symphony of uncertainty. The 5 minutes stretched out, each second an eternity. Graham's gaze remained fixed on Tyrese, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had entrusted his daughter's fate to this boy, this stranger. It was a gamble, a desperate act of faith in the face of overwhelming despair. And as he watched, he prayed for a miracle. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Graham Ellison. He stood by the window, the city lights blurring through the glass, each shimmer a painful reminder of the vibrant life his daughter, Leia, was missing. 12 years old. 12 years of laughter, of scraped knees and bedtime stories, now suspended in a sterile, white room. He clenched his jaw, the knot in his stomach tightening with each shallow breath. He couldn't bear to look at her, small and still beneath the crisp white sheets. This wasn't his Leia. His Leia was a whirlwind of energy, a kaleidoscope of emotions. Not this porcelain doll. Nurse Norris cleared her throat, drawing his attention. "Mr. Ellison, the boy is here." Her voice was hesitant, laced with an uncertainty that mirrored his own. Could this homeless child, barely older than a toddler himself, truly offer any hope? He doubted it, yet the desperation gnawing at him clung to even the most improbable possibilities. He turned, bracing himself for another disappointment. The boy, Tyrese, stood just inside the doorway, small and slight, his presence swallowed by the oversized hospital gown they'd given him. He held a worn sketchbook, clutched tight against his chest like a shield. His eyes, though, were anything but timid. They held a depth, a quiet understanding that seemed incongruous with his age. They met Graham's gaze unflinchingly. "Mr. Ellison." Tyrese's voice was soft, barely a whisper, yet it carried a strange weight, a sense off-knowing. "You said you could help Leia." Graham's voice was rough, thick with unshed tears. He forced himself to look at his daughter, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor a constant, agonizing reminder of her fragile state. Tyrese nodded, his gaze fixed on Leia. He stepped closer to the bed, not touching her, but hovering near her as if sensing an invisible boundary. He opened the sketchbook, revealing a series of intricate drawings. A shadowy figure trapped in a cage of twisted metal, a single tear rolling down its cheek. A swirling vortex of gray, punctuated by flashes of red. A bicycle lying broken on the pavement. Graham felt a chill run down his spine. These were Leia's dreams. The nightmares that had plagued her sleep since the accident. The ones the doctors dismissed as phantom pain, as the brain's way of processing trauma. How could this boy, this stranger, know? "She's scared," Tyrese murmured, his voice barely audible above the hum of the medical equipment. "She keeps seeing the car crash." He pointed to one of the drawings, his finger tracing the outline of the twisted metal. "She thinks it's her fault." Graham's heart clenched. He had tried to tell her, over and over, that it wasn't. That she was just a child, riding her bike on a sunny afternoon. That the driver, distracted, hadn't seen her. But the words seemed to bounce off the walls of her coma, unheard, unabsorbed. Tyrese looked up at Graham, his eyes filled with a strange, unsettling wisdom. "Hey, I know you're scared," he said, his voice directed not at Graham, but at Leia, as if speaking directly into her subconscious. He gestured to another drawing, this one of a tangled web of lines. "You're stuck because you're trying to fix it all yourself. But you can't." His voice was gentle, soothing, like a lullaby in the hushed room. A lullaby that somehow pierced through the sterile silence, through the beeping machines, through the thick fog of Graham's despair. Graham watched, mesmerized as Tyrese flipped through the sketchbook, narrating Leia's dream, his words echoing the fragmented images, the unspoken fears. He spoke of a little girl trapped in a labyrinth of guilt, unable to find her way out. "You don't have to fix it," Tyrese continued, his gaze never leaving Leia's face. "It wasn't your fault. You just got towed forward." The heart monitor beeped faster. Graham's breath hitched. He glanced at Nurse Norris, her eyes wide with disbelief. Dr. Ortega, who had entered the room unnoticed, stood frozen, her expression a mixture of astonishment and professional skepticism. Even Yvonne, Leia's private nurse, usually stoic and impassive, stared intently at the monitor, her hand unconsciously reaching for Leia's wrist, checking her pulse. Tyrese continued, his voice gaining strength, resonating with an unexpected authority. "There's a path light, can you see it?" He pointed to the last drawing, a simple sketch of sun rising over a horizon. The heart monitor accelerated again, the beeps now a rapid, insistent rhythm. Leia's eyelids fluttered. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Graham's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat of hope against the backdrop of his long-held fear. Could this be it? Could this boy, this enigma, truly be reaching her, pulling her back from the abyss? He didn't dare to breathe, didn't dare to break the spell. He just watched, waited, prayed, as a sliver of light pierced the darkness that had enveloped them for so long. The room, once heavy with despair, now crackled with an almost palpable energy, a sense of something shifting, something changing. And in that moment, Graham knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that everything was about to be different. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Graham. He watched, his breath caught in his throat as Leia's index finger twitched. Just a flicker, barely perceptible, but undeniably there. Hope, a fragile butterfly he'd almost forgotten the feel of, stirred within the hollow cage of his chest. Could it be? Was she responding? His gaze darted to Tyrese, the boy who'd insisted, with a quiet certainty that bordered on the uncanny, that he could reach his daughter. The child remained an enigma, a small, still figure amidst the rising tide of medical professionals swarming around Leia's bed. He seemed almost detached, his dark eyes fixed on Leia's face, an unnerving calmness radiating from him. What did this boy know? What secrets did he hold within that small, unreadable frame? Nurse Norris's voice, sharp with disbelief, cut through Graham's swirling thoughts. She's listening," she stammered, her eyes wide, fixed on the faint rise and fall of Leia's chest. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor seemed to echo her words, a steady pulse against the frantic thumping of Graham's own heart. He reached out, his hand hovering over Leia's, afraid to break the fragile spell. Dr. Ortega, her initial skepticism replaced by a cautious curiosity, leaned closer, her gaze intent. "Increase the sensory stimuli," she instructed Yvonne, her voice low and steady. Yvonne, Leia's private nurse, adjusted the settings on the nearby equipment, a flicker of hesitant hope in her eyes. This was uncharted territory, a realm beyond medical textbooks and clinical trials. Tyrese remained silent, his small hand continuing its rhythmic sketching on the pad. The lines flowed effortlessly, as if guided by an unseen force. He seemed oblivious to the growing commotion around him, lost in a world only he could access. A world where Leia, trapped within the confines of her own mind, was struggling to break free. Graham felt a hand on his arm. Nurse Norris, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation, looked at him. "Mr. Ellison," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "whatever that boy is doing, it's real." Graham swallowed, his throat dry. Real. The word echoed in his mind, a beacon of light in the suffocating darkness. He looked at Tyrese again, a new wave of questions surging through him. Who was this child? What power did he possess? Another twitch. This time, Leia's lips moved, forming a silent, almost imperceptible word. She's trying to speak. Yvonne breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. The room fell silent, every breath held captive by the unfolding miracle. A wave of exhaustion washed over Graham, the emotional roller coaster of the past weeks threatening to overwhelm him. He braced himself against the bed rail, his gaze locked on Leia. He had to stay strong. He had to be there for her when she finally broke through the barrier of silence. Tyrese continued to draw, the lines on the page becoming more frantic, more urgent. His brow furrowed in concentration, a single bead of sweat tracing a path down his cheek. He was pushing, reaching into the depths of Leia's subconscious, pulling her back to the surface. Suddenly, Tyrese stopped drawing. He looked up, his eyes meeting Graham's across the room. In that moment, something shifted. A flicker of recognition, a shared memory, flashed between them. It was gone in an instant, but the residue remained, a tingling sensation at the edge of Graham's awareness. He felt a pull, a connection to this boy, deeper than he could comprehend. Leia's eyes fluttered open. A collective gasp filled the room. Her gaze, clouded with confusion, darted around, finally settling on Graham. A weak smile touched her lips. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice raspy, barely audible. Graham rushed to her side, tears streaming down his face. "Leia! Oh, Leia, you're awake." He embraced her gently, careful not to jostle her fragile form. The relief that flooded through him was so intense, so overwhelming, that it left him weak. He looked at Tyrese, his heart filled with a gratitude that transcended words. But the boy was gone. Nurse Norris hurried to the doorway, peering into the hallway. He's just vanished," she stammered, her voice tinged with bewilderment. Graham felt a pang of disappointment, mingled with a strange sense of unease. He needed to thank the boy, to understand the miracle he'd witnessed. Just then, Dr. Ortega picked up the pad Tyrese had been drawing on. Her eyes widened as she scanned the page. "Mr. Ellison," she said slowly, her voice trembling, "you need to see this." Graham took the pad, his heart pounding in his chest. The drawing depicted a scene from Leia's childhood, a birthday party held at their old house. A house they'd sold years ago, before moving to the city. In the corner of the drawing, a small figure stood apart from the other children. A boy with dark hair and serious eyes. Below the figure, a name was written in childish script. Mason Del Rey. Graham felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Mason Del Rey. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity. It was a name he hadn't heard in years, a name buried deep within the recesses of his memory, a name connected to a past he desperately tried to forget. He looked at Leia, her eyes still filled with the lingering haze of the coma. He looked at the drawing, at the name that whispered secrets he wasn't ready to face. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The lukewarm coffee tasted of stale dreams and institutional despair. Graham Ellison barely registered the taste, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fragile hope. Across the small, sterile table in the hospital cafeteria, the boy Tyrese sat hunched over a half-eaten carton of lukewarm milk, his dark eyes fixed on the swirling liquid as if it held the secrets of the universe. Graham found himself captivated by the child's quiet intensity, an intensity that seemed to belie his tender age. He'd seen that same intensity in Leia's eyes, in the fleeting moments before the accident stole her away. Could this boy, this waif of a child, truly hold the key to bringing her back? The thought, so preposterous just moments ago, now clung to him like a life raft in a storm-tossed sea. "Is your name really Tyrese?" Graham asked, his voice rough, the words catching in his throat. He watched the boy carefully, searching for any flicker of deception, any hint of fabrication in those fathomless eyes. Tyrese finally looked up, his gaze steady, unnervingly direct. He took a slow sip of milk, the small, deliberate action radiating a strange sense of calm. Why isn't he more animated? More childlike? Graham wondered, a prickle of unease weaving through the burgeoning hope. Most children, faced with a man like him, a man of influence, a man who could potentially offer a way out of their current predicament, would exhibit some sign of eagerness, some plea for help. But Tyrese remained an enigma, his silence a heavy weight in the sterile air of the cafeteria. Sometimes, Tyrese finally answered, his voice soft, barely audible above the clatter of trays and the hushed murmur of conversations around them. Graham leaned forward, his heart pounding against his ribs. "What do you mean, sometimes?" The boy shrugged, his gaze drifting back to the milk carton. "It's complicated. Complicated." The word echoed in Graham's mind, a chilling reminder of the tangled web of circumstances that had brought them to this point. His Leia, trapped in a silent world of dreams and shadows. This boy, shrouded in an equally impenetrable veil of mystery. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to protect this child, to shield him from the harsh realities that had etched themselves onto his too young face. "Your real name is Mason Del Rey." A voice interjected, crisp and professional. Dr. Ortega stood beside the table, her expression a mixture of astonishment and concern. She held a tablet, the screen illuminating her face with a ghostly glow. "Missing persons report. Age 6 at the time of disappearance. Presumed deceased." The blood drained from Graham's face. Deceased. The word hung in the air like a death knell, shattering the fragile hope he had so desperately clung to. He looked at Tyrese, at the boy who had claimed to hold the key to his daughter's awakening, and saw not a beacon of hope, but a ghost, a specter of a life stolen too soon. Tyrese, or Mason, remained impassive, his expression unchanged. But Graham noticed a subtle tightening of his small hands around the milk carton, a barely perceptible tremor that betrayed the turmoil raging within. He saw the flicker of fear in those dark eyes, the desperate attempt to maintain a facade of composure. "I don't," Tyrese stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The carefully constructed wall of calm began to crumble, revealing the frightened child beneath. Graham reached across the table, his hand hovering over the boy's. He hesitated, unsure if this touch, this gesture of comfort, would be welcome or rejected. But the raw vulnerability in Tyrese's eyes propelled him forward. He gently placed his hand over the boy's, feeling the small, trembling fingers beneath his palm. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now." The words were as much for himself as they were for the boy. He needed to believe them. He needed to believe that he could offer this lost child sanctuary, that he could somehow make amends for the horrors he had undoubtedly endured. Tyrese flinched at his touch, his body tensing. He looked at Graham, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Safe?" he echoed, the word laced with bitter irony. "No one is safe." A wave of sadness washed over Graham. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this child had seen things, experienced things, that no child should ever have to endure. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on his shoulders, adding another layer to the burden of grief and desperation he already carried. "I remember the fire," Tyrese whispered, his voice breaking. He closed his eyes, his face contorting in pain. The smoke, the screams, Graham's breath caught in his throat. He squeezed the boy's hand gently, trying to convey a sense of comfort, of reassurance. "You don't have to talk about it," he said softly. "I don't want to go back," Tyrese pleaded, his eyes still closed, tears tracing paths through the grime on his cheeks. "I don't want to go back there." The desperation in his voice tore at Graham's heart. He understood, with a clarity that shocked him, the depth of this child's fear, the terror of being thrust back into a world that had inflicted so much pain. He knew, with an unshakable conviction, that he couldn't let that happen. He looked at Dr. Ortega, his gaze pleading. We can't just send him back," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not after everything he's been through." Dr. Ortega's expression softened. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and concern. "I agree," she said softly. "We'll find a way. We'll make sure he's safe." A flicker of hope ignited in Graham's chest. He looked back at Tyrese, at the small, trembling hand clasped in his. He didn't know what the future held, what challenges lay ahead. But in that moment, in the sterile confines of the hospital cafeteria, surrounded by the ghosts of his own fears and the echoes of this child's trauma, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't abandon him. He would protect him. He would fight for him, just as he would fight for Leia. And perhaps, just perhaps, in saving this lost boy, he would also find a way to save his daughter. The connection between them, still shrouded in mystery, felt stronger than ever, a fragile thread of hope woven through the darkness. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of room 6C, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Graham Ellison. He watched the boy, Tyrese, a waif of a child with eyes too old for his 10 years, approach Leia's bedside. Graham's hand tightened on the back of the chair. Hope, a dangerous ember, flickered in his chest. Hope that this street urchin, this boy who claimed to see his daughter's dreams, could somehow bring her back. Tyrese hesitated, his small hand hovering just above Leia's. He glanced up at Graham, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Can I?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Graham swallowed, the lump in his throat thick and painful. "Please," he choked out, the word laced with desperation. "Anything. Please just bring her back." Tyrese's fingers, surprisingly warm, brushed against Leia's cool skin. A tremor ran through the boy's frame, so subtle Graham almost missed it. He stiffened, his eyes widening. Tyrese recoiled as if burned, stumbling back a step. Nurse Norris gasped, reaching out to steady the boy. "What's wrong?" Tyrese's breath hitched, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He stared at his hand, then back at Leia, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and recognition. Graham's heart pounded against his ribs. What had the boy felt? What had he seen? Dr. Ortega, her professional composure barely masking a surge of bewildered curiosity, leaned closer, her gaze fixed on the monitors tracking Leia's vital signs. "Did you see something, Tyrese?" she asked, her voice gentle yet probing. The boy remained silent, his eyes still locked on Leia. The silence stretched, taut with unspoken words, unspoken fears. Graham felt a knot tightening in his stomach. "Tell me," he silently pleaded. "Tell me what you saw." Finally, Tyrese drew a shaky breath. She spoke, he whispered, his voice barely audible. A jolt, electric and unexpected, shot through Graham. Leia had spoken. Impossible. The doctors had said, "What did she say?" He rasped, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Tyrese's eyes, dark pools reflecting an unknown depth, met Graham's. "To think she said Mason," he whispered, the name hanging in the air like a fragile butterfly's wing. Mason. The name echoed in Graham's mind, a discordant note in the sterile symphony of the hospital room. He didn't recognize it, but the effect on Tyrese's boy's face had paled, the shadows under his eyes deepening, as if the name itself carried a weight he could barely bear. Nurse Norris, her brow furrowed, glanced from Tyrese to Graham. "Mason," she repeated, a question in her tone. Graham shook his head, his thoughts a swirling vortex of confusion and a burgeoning, inexplicable dread. "I don't know anyone by that name," he said, the words catching in his throat. Tyrese's small hands clenched into fists. His eyes, distant and haunted, seemed to be looking inward, seeing something beyond the walls of the room, beyond the present moment. "I didn't know who she was then," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking to himself. The fire to smoke he so much screaming. "I just remember a girl, her eyes," he trailed off, lost in the swirling vortex of memory. Graham's breath hitched. Fire? Screaming? What was the boy talking about? He knelt beside Tyrese, his hand resting gently on the boy's thin shoulder. This child knows something. A cold hand seemed to grip his heart. He had a terrifying premonition that the truth, whatever it was, would shatter the fragile hope he clung to. Dr. Ortega, her initial skepticism now replaced by a dawning comprehension, spoke softly. "Tyrese," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "Can you tell us more about this fire?" The boy shuddered, his eyes squeezing shut. "Two don't remember much," he whispered, his voice trembling. Just the heat, the Firendander." He opened his eyes, his gaze locking onto Leia's still form. I think we crossed paths that night," he said, the words heavy with a significance that resonated deep within Graham's soul. "A connection, a shared trauma. But how? His mind reeled, struggling to grasp the implications of the boy's words. Yvonne, Leia's private nurse, who had remained silent until now, spoke, her voice tight with professional concern. "Mr. Ellison," she said, "perhaps it would be best if Tyrese rested for a while. This is clearly upsetting him." Graham, torn between the need to protect the boy and the desperate desire to uncover the truth, nodded slowly. He looked at Tyrese, his heart aching for the pain he saw reflected in the boy's eyes. "What happened that night, Tyrese?" He wondered, his mind racing, trying to piece together the fragmented puzzle of the boy's memories. "And what does it have to do with my daughter?" The room fell silent, the only sound the rhythmic beeping of the machines monitoring Leia's fragile life. The unspoken questions hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that settled over them like a shroud. Graham knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was just the beginning. The truth, whatever it may be, lay hidden beneath layers of memory and pain, waiting to be unearthed. And he knew, with a growing dread, that the revelation would change their lives forever. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the blossoming hope that filled the room. Room 6C, once a stage for hushed anxieties, now pulsed with a vibrant energy. Leia's eyelids fluttered, a fragile butterfly testing its wings. Dr. Ortega, her breath hitched in her chest, leaned closer, her medical objectivity momentarily forgotten in the face of something inexplicably miraculous. Yvonne, the private nurse, stood frozen, her hand hovering over the fore drip, a silent testament to the unexpected turn of events. Graham Ellison, his face etched with days of sleepless worry, felt a tremor run through him, a raw, primal surge of relief so potent it almost buckled his knees. He gripped the edge of the bed, knuckles white, his gaze locked onto his daughter's face as though afraid to blink, afraid the illusion would shatter. Tyrese sat quietly in the corner, a small, still figure amidst the flurry of activity. He watched Leia, his dark eyes reflecting the slow bloom of consciousness in her face. He'd seen this moment in his drawings, in the swirling colors and fragmented images that had poured from his hand onto the page. He'd felt it, too, a strange resonance, a silent echo within his own being. But seeing it unfold in reality, witnessing the tangible shift from the gray pallor of coma to the flush of life, was something else entirely. He felt a profound weariness settle over him, the exhaustion of a long journey finally reaching its end. A journey he hadn't even fully understood when he'd begun it. Leia's eyelids fluttered again, then opened, revealing eyes still clouded with the remnants of unconsciousness. The room held its breath. Graham leaned in, his voice a choked whisper. "Leia? Sweetheart, can you hear me?" Her eyes, the same shade of blue as the summer sky, slowly focused on his face. A flicker of recognition, a fragile spark, ignited within their depths. She blinked again, a small frown creasing her brow as if trying to piece together a fragmented puzzle. The world around her swam back into focus. The beeping of machines, the worried faces, the sterile white walls of the hospital room. Fear, a cold, familiar grip, tightened around her chest, pulling her back towards the shadowy abyss of a nightmare she'd been trapped in. The swirling vortex of the accident, the screech of tires, the blinding pain, then she saw him. The boy in the corner, small and quiet, his presence a strange anchor in the swirling chaos of her returning consciousness. His eyes, deep and knowing, held a calmness that seeped into her, a silent reassurance. He had been there, in her dreams, a guiding presence through the fear and confusion. He was real. A faint smile touched her lips. "You came back," she whispered, her voice raspy, barely audible. Tyrese nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. His own heart, a bird trapped in his chest, finally began to slow its frantic beating. "I promised I would," he replied, his voice soft, yet firm. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that he had made that promise, not just in this room, not just in this life, but somewhere beyond the realm of his conscious memory. Dr. Ortega, her initial skepticism replaced by awestruck wonder, moved forward, her medical instruments forgotten in her hand. She checked Leia's vitals, her movements efficient, yet hesitant, as though afraid to break the fragile spell that had settled over the room. The readings were stable, almost impossibly so. She looked at Tyrese, a question forming in her eyes, a question that extended beyond the realm of medical science, a question that delved into the mysteries of the human spirit. She had witnessed countless medical miracles in her career, but this was different. This transcended the boundaries of her understanding. Nurse Norris, standing just outside the circle of light surrounding the bed, felt tears prick her eyes. She had initially dismissed the boy's claims as childish fantasies, the product of a traumatized mind. But now, witnessing this inexplicable awakening, she felt a wave of shame wash over her. She had underestimated the power of human connection, the invisible threads that bind us together, the unseen forces that shape our lives. Graham, his face transformed by a radiant joy, knelt beside his daughter, his hand gently stroking her hair. "Leia, my sweet girl, you're back. You're really back." He couldn't comprehend the how or why, but at that moment, understanding didn't matter. All that mattered was that his daughter was alive, awake, and looking at him with eyes that held the promise of a future he had almost given up on. He glanced at Tyrese, his heart swelling with a gratitude so profound it ached. He didn't know who this boy was, where he came from, or what mysterious gift he possessed, but he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he owed him everything. He would take care of him, protect him, give him a home, a family. This boy, who had appeared on his doorstep like a stray in the storm, had brought light back into his life. Yvonne, her professional detachment finally crumbling, stepped forward and gently adjusted Leia's blankets. Her own eyes, usually so clinical and observant, now shimmered with unshed tears. This was a moment that transcended medical charts and diagnoses, a moment of pure, unadulterated hope, a moment that reaffirmed her faith in the inherent goodness of humanity, in the resilience of the human spirit, a moment that reminded her why she had chosen this profession, this calling, this sacred duty to care for the vulnerable, to witness the fragility and the strength of human life. Dr. Ortega straightened up, her voice hushed with reverence. "Sometimes," she murmured, her gaze shifting between Leia and Tyrese, "miracles come disguised as lost children." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, a testament to the inexplicable mysteries that lie at the heart of human existence. The mysteries of the mind, the mysteries of the heart, the mysteries that defy logic and reason, the mysteries that remind us that there is more to this world than what we can see and touch and measure. The implications of Tyrese's past, the legal complexities of guardianship, the myriad questions that swirled around his uncanny ability, these were all matters for another day. For now, in the quiet sanctuary of room 6C, bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, there was only the simple, profound joy of a miracle witnessed, a life restored, a connection forged in the crucible of shared experience. A connection that would forever bind these three souls together, a connection that would shape their destinies in ways they couldn't yet imagine.